Shocks and Surgeries, the case of the Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital. My name is Nadine Finley, and I'm the Assistant Curator at the Lakeshore Grounds Interpretive Center and your host this evening. Every year through the month of October, Humber College recognizes Mental Health Month. For the 2020 edition, the Lakeshore Grounds Interpretive Center has decided to focus its programming on reducing stigma, combating stereotypes, and promoting information on respectful representation of the lived experience of mental health care within the history of the Lakeshore Grounds. I'd like to start off the event by grounding ourselves in the space that we share. The Lakeshore Grounds Interpretive Center at Humber College is located within the traditional and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, known as Adobagok, the place of the alders, in the Michi-Sagig language. The region is uniquely situated along the Humber River watershed, which has historically provided an integral connection for Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples between Lake Ontario and Lake Simcoe in the Georgian Bay regions. Now home to numerous nations, Adobagok provides a vital source of interconnection for all. Today we are all zooming in from across Turtle Island, so we welcome you to reflect on the traditional and ancestral lands that you are sharing. So some housekeeping items. Normally at this point I would direct you to the facilities, but as we're all in our own homes, you know what the facilities are. Our session is video recorded from now until 8 p.m. and this does not include any questions or comments you enter into the chat. On the attendee side, your videos are all off and muted, so if something happens in the background, you're totally good for that. We also have live captioning during this event, which will appear on the bottom of your screens. If you just hover over, you'll see a captioning option. You can turn that on, view the full transcript, or sort of select your preference from there. During the event, the chat function will serve to connect you with the presenters. You can use the chat to ask us questions throughout the presentation, which will be collected by our behind-the-scenes volunteers. They will be the only ones who are able to see your questions. They will acknowledge your message when they've received it and add it to the queue to be answered by our presenters toward the end of the hour today. The chat box should also appear at the bottom of your screen and expand to the right side when you click on it. It may look slightly different if you're joining us on a mobile device, which often requires you to swipe to see the full line of features available. Tonight's presentation may raise some difficult topics featuring mental health, institutionalization, shock therapies, and psychosurgeries. For those among you who are Humber students, we are joined this evening by a student support and intervention coordinator who is providing active listening tonight. This means that they're available throughout the event if you would like to talk to somebody about what you're hearing or any issues that the presentations might raise. To connect with the coordinator, just send a message in the chat and our volunteers will assist you. For our community attendees, there are many resources available should you want to speak with someone in the same way. Again, our volunteers can connect you with their numbers through the chat feature. And jumping right into the content, because we have a lot to get through today, and I'm sure both our speakers are quite eager. A little bit about the history of the Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital before we discuss the shocks and surgeries part of our event. I'll begin with a brief introduction to the subject of our case. Tonight, when discussing the history of the former Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital, we'll be using vocabulary that was appropriate to the period. For example, instead of mental health care center, you'll hear us refer to the institution as the asylum when talking about the 19th century and hospital when talking about the 20th century. Similarly, instead of mental health or mental illness, you may hear the term insanity when referring to periods when this term was commonly used. The hospital itself ran for 89 years on the Lakeshore grounds in South Etobicoke from 1890 until 1979. During its operation, the hospital saw many forms of treatment evolve through time with ideas drawn and adapted from Europe and the United States. Throughout its history, the hospital was known under several names, including the Mimico Branch Asylum, the Mimico Asylum, Ontario Hospital Mimico, Ontario Hospital New Toronto, and finally the Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital. During the period of our focus tonight, the speakers will be more commonly referring to it as Ontario Hospital New Toronto. This institution opened in response to a crisis of overcrowding in the province, whose existing institutions in Toronto, Kingston, Hamilton, and London were filled beyond capacity, and the jail system was being used to provide additional space for patients. Get the slide there. The solution proposed at the time was to provide an additional care facility in the province to house individuals diagnosed as chronically insane, meaning they were deemed unlikely to be discharged in their lifetime. There we go. The result was the opening of the Mimico Branch Asylum, which operated initially as an extension of the Toronto Asylum before becoming its own independent institution in 1894. The initial treatment at these institutions was called moral treatment. Now, moral treatment, as it was adapted in North America, was all about the environment. Being in the physical environment of the institution, usually placed in idyllic locations like along a lake or featuring gardens and open green spaces surrounded by farmland, was an essential component to the treatment. But it wasn't just the physical environment that was important. It was what a person did in that environment that was key to moral treatment. A big emphasis was on the expectations that patients would work as part of their treatment. Patients were not paid for their labor, and since it was a part of their treatment, refusal could be interpreted as a symptom of their illness. The Mimico Branch Asylum was constructed according to what was known as the cottage plan, or a series of individual buildings rather than a single structure, with the intent to create a more home-like atmosphere, as well as mitigate potential risks of a fire or an outbreak from spreading across the hospital population. Many of the institution's buildings were constructed and maintained by inpatient labor throughout the hospital's history. Institutionalization and labor were two of the constant components throughout the history of the Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital, but over the years, these treatments were joined by other therapies, including hydrotherapy, drug therapies, occupational therapy, art therapy, and of course, the shock therapies and psychosurgeries you will hear about tonight. We have been building a series of resources on our website that highlight the different aspects of the hospital's history, and I encourage you to explore these after our event by visiting lakeshoregrounds.ca. You'll find a list of hospital history-related resources under the History tab. And on that note, I would like to introduce our two presenters. One of the screens who you will see today is Dr. Brianne M. Collins, who was the inaugural researcher in residence at the Lakeshore Grounds Interpretive Center in 2020, and is assistant professor of psychology at Providence University College in Otterburn, Manitoba. She specializes in the history of psychology and psychiatry and has spent the past decade exploring the history of psychosurgery in Canada and internationally. The other screen you will see today is Dr. Jennifer Bazar, who is the curator of the Lakeshore Grounds Interpretive Center at Humber College. Her main area of research is the history of mental health institutionalization, where her primary interests are in the lived experience of patients and staff during the 19th and 20th century. I will return at the end of the event to help relay your questions to Jennifer and Brianne, but for now I pass the invisible microphone over to our presenters.
On Monday of this week, just timing coincidence, BlogTO republished its annual list of the most haunted places in Toronto. And this is a list that it publishes absolutely every single October. And for the past 5 years, the Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital has been strongly represented. And they're not alone. I'm not trying to single out BlogTO in any ways. This is, if you're not familiar with it, it's an online news site. There's other local sources that do the same kind of thing every year: Narcity, Torontoist, Notable Life, Indie 88, Daily Hive, and even our own student union at Humber, Ignite, as well as our student newspaper, the Etc. They've each published online articles in recent years that identify the hospital grounds as spooky in some way, whether it's specifically about ghosts or some other kind of related idea. And of course, as those of you who are joining us know, if you live in the area, this is not a new phenomenon. Ever since the closure of the Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital in 1979, there's been a growing number of stories meant to give you goosebumps when you visit the grounds. And this isn't unique to our area. The association between former mental health institutions and ghosts is something it's a little bit more universal than just our local Etobicoke story. And if I turn the analogy around a little bit, which is, sorry, I'm a little bit cheesy sometimes, it's a trope that really haunts mental health in a way. Um, so this is what we want to address tonight. As Nadine mentioned, our goal is throughout this month has been to address some of the misconceptions and the stigma associated with the history of the Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital. And so tonight we're going to look at some of the more controversial and more misrepresented treatments in this history, specifically shock therapies and psychosurgeries. But before we're able to do that, before we jump into the treatments themselves, what Brianne and I are going to do is look at some of the popular portrayals of these treatments on film and highlight what we see as a disturbing trend that has been developing over recent decades. Oh, and Brianne, I think you might be on mute if you're, there we go.
To move the mouse over enough to unmute. It's only fitting to begin with The Snake Pit, which was released in 1948. And it's especially fitting because the star of the film, Olivia de Havilland, recently passed away just recently in July. The film is based on a novel published by Mary Jane Ward. It was published originally in 1946. And it tells the story of Virginia Cunningham, who finds herself in a mental hospital on account of delusions she's experiencing. As she struggles to remember how she got there, she navigates a heavily overcrowded institution and undergoes various treatments, including hydrotherapy and electroshock therapy. On the whole, the film is fairly accurate for the time in terms of her facing chronic wards that are full of patients who are not responding to treatments. And as well in terms of the kinds of treatments used and the way in which they're used. In part, this is because it was published, or it was released in 1948, and it's portraying roughly the same time, which helps. Nevertheless, what is especially interesting about this film's portrayal of electroshock therapy is that although Cunningham is initially fearful of receiving this treatment, it's very clear to the audience, and eventually even to herself, that she's improving. Eventually so much so that she's able to leave the hospital.
Now, the 1960s and 1970s represent a period of fairly significant change in how mental health was actually portrayed on film. And the best known example of this is One Flew Over Cuckoo's Nest, which is a 1975 film based on an earlier book. And the film tells the story of a man, McMurphy, who's been transferred from a prison farm to a mental health institution for observation. And he finds himself in this battle for control, sort of a authority figure kind of control, with a cold and heartless staff member who's known as Nurse Ratched. And in one scene, 3 of the patients, including McMurphy, are punished for acting out by being dragged from their ward and given electroshock therapy. And it's a really difficult scene to watch. If you haven't seen it already, I do want to give you that caveat ahead of time. But the experience only encourages McMurphy in his quest to defeat Nurse Ratched in some way. And the film ends, and this is spoiler if you haven't seen it, when McMurphy receives a lobotomy after he makes an attack on Nurse Ratched following the suicide of a fellow patient. And McMurphy is walked back to the ward with 2 orderlies on either side and placed into a bed. And he's found to be completely comatose and unresponsive with surgery scars on his head, which, sort of that classic image of a patient who is comatose after a lobotomy, which what you'll hear tonight from Brianne is an exaggeration of the outcomes of these procedures. And what happens with these procedures and the tone is it drastically changed the attitudes around institutionalization as well as shock therapy and psychosurgery in the 60s and 70s. It really had a lasting impact. And there was no association to treatment in the treatments portrayed. It was really more about a story of a fight against authority. And perhaps just to emphasize that point, the character of Nurse Ratched has actually gone on to be named the 5th greatest villain in film history.
Despite what One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest came to represent and the message it communicated about mental illness, treatments, and institutionalization, we don't find it necessarily as bad now, or maybe as rebelling against our understanding of mental illness as we once did. And I think in part it's because some of these of the more extreme portrayals that have followed since that time. So for instance, in an episode of Criminal Minds from 2013, the BAU finds themselves on a case where a young John Doe is found with drill marks at the corner of his eyes. The team eventually concludes that this is evidence of a lobotomy conducted by the unsub that they're pursuing. And then in the 7th season of Murdoch Mysteries, Murdoch investigates a case of a murdered woman and finds himself chasing a psychiatrist who's experimenting on people with lobotomies in an attempt to cure criminal behavior, and is eventually killed by one of the people he operates on. Both of these portrayals present lobotomies as something that can be wielded both to harm others at the hands of criminals and also as a possible remedy for the behavior of those same criminals.
And so very similarly, electroshock therapy has been presented in the same way. Two just very quick examples are both television series. American Horror Story uses electroshock in a number of different episodes against various characters as a violent form of torture. And in the 2nd season of the series Stranger Things, Eleven's mother actually receives violent electroshock procedures that leave her trapped in an endless loop in her mind while her body sits in a catatonic state. And these scenes are graphic, and although they emulate the messaging that was associated with electroshock in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, there's no remaining association between the procedure and therapy. It's purely an instrument of torture that is being used to subdue those who are daring to speak out, which is something that I'll talk more about when we introduce the shock therapies.
Arguably, the most extreme portrayal to date can be found in Netflix's new series, Ratched. It's intended as a prequel to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest that's set in the 1940s and follows Nurse Ratched's early career. What is most troubling about this series, among other things, is, and in particular related to our discussion here, is the graphic and grossly inaccurate way in which lobotomies are portrayed. For instance, a lobotomy is carried out using a power drill in one episode, and in another, a lobotomy is used to murder one of its characters. So it's really, the violent nature of this procedure is really played up by this particular representation.
And these are just a few examples that paint this disturbing trend towards what we see as a growing picture of violent portrayals of shocks and surgery that have found their way onto the screen over the past few decades. And as a result, have filtered into how we see mental health care today that goes beyond just these particular treatments. So we're going to transition now to the therapies themselves. And this is where it's going to seem a bit funny, because you will hear elements that are uncomfortably reminiscent to these fictional examples that we've just presented. But what we take issue with is the tone and the increasing dramatization of this extreme. So we're not hoping to put on, sort of rose-colored glasses tonight and tell you about these treatments. Instead, what we're aiming to do is to go back to the snake pit in a way and capture some of the layers of truth that more accurately represent these therapies, what they were, why they were adopted, and how they were used. And sorry, my slide thing is just a little slow sometimes. There it goes. Thank you. So shock therapies, we're going to begin there. There were 3 main types of shock therapies introduced in Ontario in the 1930s and the 1940s: insulin, metrazole, and electroshock. And for each of these, the Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital, or what would be known during the time as the Ontario Hospital New Toronto, was a key player. And so my plan this evening is to introduce these 3 therapies as they arrived at New Toronto, along with a few case studies to remind us of the people who were receiving these procedures. But I do want to mention that the sources that I've been working with are quite limited, and none of them provide the voices of the patients involved in these procedures. So it is very much sort of the procedures themselves and how they were being applied. Sorry, keep clicking. So let me set the scene first. So shock therapies began to be adopted in Ontario in 1937. And the Ontario Hospital New Toronto was nearly 50 years old by this time, and it was facing a whole series of struggles. So if you think about the 1930s, we're in the interwar years. And so the hospital is still seeing admissions related to the impact of the First World War. They've started to recover some of the staffing that they lost during the war, but their numbers are not quite the same. And their finances are severely restricted because the country is in the midst of a severe economic depression. And then drastically, what we see on the hospital side is the patient population at New Toronto begins to jump really drastically. The hospital officially had always been overcrowded ever since 1900, all the way across. It had been averaging just above 600, and it's an institution that was designed initially for 500 people. But when we enter into the 1930s, the decade spikes drastically, reaching over 1,000 patients, and an all-time high in 1939 of 1,542 individuals that are admitted as patients in New Toronto. So I think you can get a sense of the atmosphere of the institution at the time. It's literally bursting at the seams just by the sheer number of people who are being admitted as patients, and it's struggling to meet capacity, both in terms of space, but also in terms of staff and budgets. But there's also another element that is sort of under development during this time that I'd like to introduce, and that's fever therapies. So fever therapies were introduced in the early 1930s in Ontario hospitals, specifically to treat something called general paresis or neurosyphilis. And neurosyphilis can develop when syphilis is left untreated, and it results in absolutely debilitating physical and mental symptoms that eventually lead to the person's death. In Austria in 1917, it was discovered that syphilis, the bacteria itself, was actually susceptible to heat, and that it could be eliminated if the body temperature could be raised high enough. And so this was initially done by giving people inoculations of malaria. But very soon after, through the 1920s, there was different apparatus and chemical treatments that were developed that were intended to create the same effect of raising that body temperature. So at the Ontario Hospital, New Toronto, fever therapies were introduced in 1931. And initially this was through the use of artificial fevers. Their very first apparatus that they used was called a Victor superpowered diathermy apparatus, which is actually the image that you're seeing on your screens is the particular model that they were using. And patients would be given a series of intravenous chemicals, and then electrodes from this apparatus would be attached to their bodies, and the machine's currents would artificially raise their body temperature to somewhere around 104 degrees Fahrenheit. And New Toronto would use varying types of fever therapy, including the malarial and chemical treatments through the 1930s and 1940s, with varying levels of success depending on the individual. And these were eventually replaced by penicillin when it became more widely available in the 1950s. Now, fever therapies have an entire history that is much more complex than what I'm laying out here. But the reason I mention them is that they help to illustrate the atmosphere that welcomed in the shock therapies to our mental health institutions. So here's a devastating illness that there's no existing treatment that has an effect on it. So general paresis is not going to be cured by something like moral treatment. But they are seeing results and an impact from these very harsh physical treatments. And so the concept itself kind of opens a doorway. So the first to enter that door in Ontario, at least, was insulin shock treatment or insulin coma treatment. And this treatment was developed in Vienna in 1933. And the premise involved repeatedly giving somebody large doses of insulin in order to produce a coma. And so the patient would be put into this coma and then brought out of it by being given a sugar solution. And the process was repeated every day over a period of several weeks. And it's an extremely labor-intensive procedure, not to mention physically strenuous on the individual receiving this. It required trained physicians and nurses, as well as a dedicated space within the institution. But physicians in the 1930s and 1940s really believed strongly in the effects of this coma experience and what impacts it would have on the patients. And they claimed recovery rates of 80 or 90%. So insulin coma therapy continued to be used regularly up until the 1950s when psychopharmaceuticals began to be introduced. And what was key about this was not just those high cure rates, but it was who it was supposedly helping to recover. And specifically, it was believed to be beneficial to those who had a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is an illness that's characterized by episodes of psychosis, and it often has symptoms of hallucinations, delusions, or disorganized thinking. And in Ontario, about half of the resident population in all of our mental health institutions combined in the 1930s had a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So this is sort of the #1 diagnosis that the physicians are seeing at this time. So with publications internationally publishing recovery rates in the 80% and 90% range, you can understand then why it was something that they were bringing into the province, why this was sort of a procedure that they were pursuing. And, you know, as I mentioned, it was a space and labor intensive therapy. So what happened in Ontario was that insulin shock therapy was based almost exclusively at New Toronto. I've been digging through the files still, but I haven't seen it used at another Ontario hospital before 1946, when it's first adopted at London. And then a year later, it starts to spread a little bit wider into the province. So it's almost a decade where it's located entirely at New Toronto. Now, as I mentioned, insulin was introduced in 1937 in Ontario, and initially it was on a trial basis. So the clinic that they opened in New Toronto was led by Dr. Norman Easton. And again, for those of you who are in the neighborhood, I'll mention this just for yourselves. Dr. Easton actually lived on the hospital property with his family in the home that used to sit beside the North Creek. It's no longer standing, but if you're familiar with the area, you'll sort of have an idea of where I mentioned. And so the initial trial patients were a group of 12 women who all had a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And the trial was set up such that there were 6 women who served as controls and 6 women who served as experimental subjects, which means that all 12 of the women experienced the same exact procedures, but only 6 of them received the actual injections of insulin that would produce the coma. Now, the first injection was given on May 31st, 1937, and this trial of the initial 12 women was deemed to be successful because those who actually, the 6 who received the insulin, showed higher remission rates than those who did not receive the insulin. And so immediately afterwards, within that same year, a dedicated 20-bed unit was assigned to insulin shock therapy at New Toronto. Now, a year after insulin shock therapy was introduced at New Toronto, the major Toronto newspapers published detailed reports from Easton's clinic about the procedure, the rationale, and they actually included a series of anonymized case studies. So that's what I want to share. I just want to pick one of those out to share with you. So in 1936, an 80-year-old woman from Toronto who was described as being a skilled athlete who was attending college, she began to experience what the newspaper only termed as mental disturbance. She doesn't give any more detail about what those symptoms looked like. Roughly a year later, by April of 1937, she was being described as irritable and fatigued, and that she was experiencing extreme fear and even fits of crying in relation to her upcoming summer exams at school. So that month, she was admitted as a patient to the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital, where she was observed to be striking out at other patients and breaking dishes. She started to express concerns that her food had been poisoned, and was experiencing periods of catatonia where her body would actually freeze in different positions for longer periods of time. Now, in May of the same year, she was transferred to a private sanatorium where her behavior, the similar kinds of reports are being described. She arrived at the Ontario Hospital New Toronto in January of 1938. At that time, she was no longer speaking, and she was being tube fed twice a day in order to bring food into her. She was given insulin shock treatment beginning on February 24th, 1938, and within 4 days, it was reported that she was beginning to eat the meals herself, and within a month, she was speaking independently. Now, the treatments were continued, and by April 7th, she was reported to be working on the ward with the other patients and participating in recreation, and she was discharged as cured on April 28th, 1938. She was at New Toronto for 68 days, and during that time, she received 49 insulin injections. Now, I'll come back to insulin in a little bit, but I want to make sure to introduce the other 2 treatments as well. Now, given the difficulty around administering insulin shock therapy, Ontario's mental health institutions adopted a new shock therapy in 1938 called Metrazol. And Metrazol is a white powder that looks a lot like a talcum powder. patients would be injected with metrazole just below their elbow joint, and this would produce a convulsion within about 30 seconds or so. And the convulsions would last for several minutes, and they were described to be similar in appearance to an epileptic seizure. And then once the seizure was complete, the patient would then experience a period of complete disorientation and confusion that could last upwards of 30 minutes. And by 1938, largely as a result of the work that he had been doing in insulin shock at New Toronto, Dr. Easton was named Director of Research for all of Ontario's mental health hospitals, and he was placed in charge of overseeing how metrazole was being introduced. And so this saw both New Toronto and London being the first institutions to begin using metrazole on their patients. So from the same newspaper records, when Dr. Easton was sharing these reports, the metrazole program had only been running for about 2 months, maybe even a little bit less, but he described his sort of reaction as very hopeful. And one of the cases that he shared with the papers describes a man who received one of the early rounds of metrazole at New Toronto when he was admitted in December of 1936. He was only 25 years old, from Toronto, but he had a 14-year history of institutionalization and confinement, including time spent at a reform school and in the Ontario Reformatory Guelph. The man was described as being uncooperative and that he was dirty in his habits. When he was admitted to the Ontario Hospital New Toronto, the staff said that he was hard to handle, that he attacked the other patients, that he broke windows, and they also added an extra note that he would hold food in his hands or in his mouth for hours at a time. Now, he received his first metrazole injection on May 9th, 1938, and at the time Easton relayed his story to the newspapers, he had received an additional 4 injections. The man's demeanor was being described even after that period of time as being, markedly improved, that he was spending time with other patients, that he was cleaner in his appearance, eating regularly, and most importantly, that he was being cooperative with staff. Now, the final shock therapy of the 3 to be introduced to Ontario's institutions during this period was electroshock therapy, which many of you may know today as a different variation of electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. They're related in their history, but it's not the same way that it's administered. Now, as best as I can tell from the records, I believe it was adopted in the province around 1942, but I don't have an exact date yet. And as an interesting aside, this date is after psychosurgery enters the scene in Ontario, which you'll hear about from Brianne momentarily. Even more than metrazole, which was considered relatively low effort in comparison to insulin shock therapy, electroshock therapy quickly became the most popular of the 3. It was less time consuming and it required less staff. So electroshock, sorry, lost my place for a second. Oh, right. So it was developed in Italy in 1938, specifically as a means to replace the biological forms of shock. So things like insulin shock or metrazole. And the procedure involves using a machine to pass electricity into the head of the individual through a pair of electrodes that are pressed onto their temples. And like the other shock therapies, it's administered repeatedly over a period of days, weeks, or even months, depending on the individual. And in the first 3 years, it was reported that approximately 400 individuals were treated by electroshock in Toronto, which, as best I can tell from the sources, is describing the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital and both the Ontario Hospital Toronto and Ontario Hospital New Toronto. But I'm still piecing that information together a little bit. And so this brings me to my final case study, which comes to us thanks to my co-presenter, and her research. And I think you'll see momentarily why we wanted to share this particular history with you as part of this discussion. So the case is that of a shy and very reserved 32-year-old woman who had a difficult home life growing up. And she was admitted to the Ontario Hospital New Toronto in February 23rd, 1939, after she'd experienced about a 2-year period of ill health, which had begun after it was suggested to her that she leave school because she had some failing vision. And then reportedly, she became increasingly self-conscious about her vision and began to express delusions that people were watching her. She began to withdraw more and more before eventually refusing to leave the home and responding violently if anybody tried to make her leave. When she arrived at New Toronto, she was exhibiting both visual and auditory hallucinations and was given a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Now, that year, she initially received 89 treatments of insulin shock therapy that resulted in 48 comas. And then she also received 16 metrazole injections. But she continued to be reported in the case as violent, as impulsive, and destructive. Twice in the 1940s, she received electroshock therapy, both times about 20 treatments at a time. And then in 1950 was admitted to the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital as a candidate for psychosurgery, and specifically leucotomy, which is why Brianne came across this case within her research. And so being gathered, I mean, the notes, this comes from the notes from a leucotomy conference as they're evaluating this individual for that procedure. So we really don't see much outside the observed behaviors that they're evaluating in relation to whether or not she qualifies for this procedure. But we do see this really lengthy history of shock therapies. And that's something that became quite characteristic, is that individuals would be moved sort of through the different shock therapies and even potentially to surgery, sort of during their time, if they were not seeing the results that they were looking for. Now, the shock therapies were continued up until about the 1950s in Ontario, when electroshock therapy, with electroshock therapy continuing to this day. And aside from the violence that shocks do cause to the body through these treatments, I think you can see why movies would want to pick them up, right? I mean, you can pick up on, even just the physical elements of what would be happening as part of these procedures. But to make things worse, really, within that, looking back at those popular portrayals, I've been chasing some sources that indicate that consent was eliminated from shock therapies in Ontario in the mid to late 1940s. So they were no longer informing family in the same way that they had before when an individual was undergoing these procedures. And I haven't seen the same information for New Toronto because we're very limited in the sources we have for this particular hospital. But other projects I've worked on in the province do reveal that there is strong evidence that these procedures were used to control those who were acting out or who were otherwise considered unruly, which I think you see from some of the cases that I've presented here. But on that note, I am going to pass things back over to my colleague.
All right. So I'm going to talk a bit about kind of taking off where Jennifer's left off. And I want to start by saying that Ontario Hospital New Toronto holds a really important place in the history of psychosurgery in this province. And by this is assuming I am sitting in Ontario as I say that, not in Manitoba. So in this/that province, and in Canada also more broadly. And this is because the first patient to receive the treatment in Ontario and across Canada was a patient from this very hospital. The patient, whom we'll call Jenny to protect her privacy, was a 58-year-old female, and she had been admitted several times to the Ontario Hospital New Toronto. And Jenny was initially diagnosed with involutional melancholia, which was a form of depression thought to affect the elderly. But then she was also diagnosed with psychosis during a subsequent admission on account of delusions that she was experiencing. And based on an evaluation of her case by physicians and the neurosurgeon who would perform the surgery, Jenny became the first person to undergo a bilateral frontal leucotomy in this country. In my talk this evening, I'm going to tell you about the psychosurgery program that Ontario Hospital New Toronto was part of, and how patients such as Jenny ended up becoming recipients of this treatment in the first place. And I'm going to focus more on that direction and say less about outcomes here, in part because a lot of the records that we have, at least from Ontario, is really kind of the front end in terms of looking at who should have the surgery and kind of, I guess we're going to get to it, but what Jennifer was talking about with those leucotomy conferences where you find out about kind of past treatments and their past histories. But I'll say a little here and there as we go, nevertheless. So before we get too far though, I do want to talk a little bit about what I mean when I say psychosurgery. There are actually a number of definitions for this term, but this is one that I find especially helpful. It was provided by several physicians working in the Department of Neurological Surgery at a hospital in New York in 2001. In an article that they wrote. So they explained that psychosurgery refers to any surgical procedure that attempts to alter, through manipulation of neural tissue, a thought or thought process that is associated with a psychiatric disorder, and that is not caused by any known structural lesion. So there are several important aspects of this definition to take note of. So first, clearly it's a surgical procedure performed on the brain. Second, it's where neurosurgeons intentionally are doing something to brain tissue that, for all intents and purposes, appears normal. Third, procedures that can be classified as psychosurgery are done in order to alter cognition, also affect, but also, with those two considered, by extension behavior. And it's those things that are related specifically to mental illness. As you can see here, there are actually a number of surgical techniques that would meet the criteria in the definition that we just looked at. And this is because the term psychosurgery is really an umbrella term for a number of different neurosurgical techniques, many of which are no longer used today. As we talk this evening about the procedure that was done in Ontario, you'll largely hear the term leucotomy. And I'm also not going to go into the kind of detail on the different kinds of procedures, or even in much detail the procedure itself, just for the sake of time, but also because it can be fairly graphic when I do so. But if anybody's interested, I'm happy to talk more about it later, or to provide resources in a different setting for that. More than half a decade before Jenny underwent the first leucotomy in Ontario, a woman only 5 years her senior received the first leucotomy operation in the world. This initial procedure was conducted in Portugal in 1935 by a neurologist named Igaz Moniz and a young neurosurgeon named Almeida Lima. Not only did Moniz decide to call his procedure a prefrontal leucotomy, giving us the term leucotomy that we know, he also incidentally coined the umbrella term psychosurgery. The first leucotomy operation in Canada was performed on Jenny from New Toronto on July 23rd, 1941 by Kenneth George Mackenzie, who was Canada's first formally trained neurosurgeon. Following Jenny's operation on July 23rd, 1941, another 20 patients would also receive psychosurgery operations by April 11th, 1945. Of these 21 patients, 7 were from Ontario Hospital, New Toronto. And the remaining 14 were from places like Ontario Hospital, Toronto, London, and Hamilton, as well as the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital. This initial group of patients was carefully selected and studied before and after their operations by the physicians at the research unit of the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital. Because of its connections with the University of Toronto and its emphasis on research, the TPH, as it's called, if you use the abbreviation TPH, it received a hefty influx of funds in 1939 from the Rockefeller Foundation in the US that allowed them to open this research unit. Along with research on psychosurgery, studies were conducted on shock therapies and several other treatments. Following the 21st operation that took place in early April of 1945, surgery suddenly stopped. The primary reason for this was that the funding that had come from the Rockefeller Foundation had run out. And then this resulted in there needing to be a break or a hiatus in the leucotomy program because there wasn't enough staff, for instance, as well as other resources to continue with the program. Although, even though there's no surgeries that are happening in this period, psychosurgery remained on the radar for physicians and the public alike. For instance, in June of 1945, Kenneth Mackenzie, again, the neurosurgeon who performed the procedures, met with C.B. Farrar, who was the director of the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital, and as well as 2 administrators from Ontario's Department of Health. And they were getting together to talk about the first 20 cases. They all agreed, quote, that the results from this treatment are much more satisfactory than the results from shock therapies. As well, there were also a number of, a growing number, I should say, of newspaper articles that were talking about the promise offered by psychosurgery, especially in the mid to late 1940s. And this led families to put pressure on hospital superintendents so that their loved ones could receive the operation. And in turn, superintendents then put pressure on the Department of Health to restart the leucotomy program. One such request, came from T.D. Cumberland, who was the superintendent at Ontario Hospital, New Toronto. In his letter, he said, quote, "I am getting letters from relatives regarding leucotomy operations, that relatives are aware of the fact that this is being done over in the United States and also by the military hospital in Ontario. And there has been considerable publicity about it. They are rather critical of the fact that no provision is made for it in Ontario hospitals." And so you might wonder why I've already shown, the revived program here. Well, it's because the Department of Health was, I'm sure, pleased that they could write back to Cumberland and say, "I think you missed the memo. The program started several months ago." And in response, Cumberland just says, "Thank you, and I will start, looking at referring patients from New Toronto to the TPH." So why was the department able to restart the program all of a sudden in April of 1948? Well, it's because in 1948, you have federal mental health grants, well, I should say health grants more broadly, but then also some set aside for mental health grants, that were things that the provinces could apply for on a project-by-project basis. And the leucotomy program at the TPH ended up being one of those projects. So between April of 1948 and January of 1963, 354 operations were performed via the TPH's leucotomy program, 52 of which came from Ontario Hospital, New Toronto, and of those, 45 were women and 7 were men. And they ranged in age from 22 to 65 years old, with the average age being 44 and a half years old. Now, you might think, well, and it would be true, 354 is a lot, but this is just one hospital. Because of that federal grant funding, places like London and Kingston were able to develop, and Hamilton were able to develop their own programs, and kind of, so they didn't have to send patients through the TPH anymore themselves, which made more room for places like New Toronto to add patients, as well as other hospitals like even Ontario Hospital, Toronto. So next, I'm going to talk you through the process that a patient would go through to become a recipient of this kind of procedure. So physicians at the Ontario hospitals were invited to refer appropriate patients to the TPH for consideration. And appropriate candidates included those with a chronic mental illness, those who had been unresponsive to other treatments. And so this is where this intersects in part with shock therapies. And we saw that last patient at the end of Jennifer's. And you have all of a sudden where, if you're not responding, then you're identified as potentially a good candidate, especially if you're causing problems at the hospital in terms of behavior, because there certainly was this link between those who were, quote, talked about as nursing problems that were often targeted, though not only, but often. As well as people who were considered to have a poor prognosis were also considered to be appropriate candidates. Now, the TPH did indicate in their memo in 1948 that there were some diagnoses that were not appropriate to treat using leucotomy. These included psychopathy and drug addicts. Names and short case descriptions were then provided to the TPH by physicians to determine whether patients that the Ontario Hospital was thinking of referring were actually going to be appropriate candidates to be considered for psychosurgery. So once the TPH then ended up confirming a patient could be considered for operation, and after consent was obtained from the patient's family, the patient was then transferred to the TPH. And unlike we see with electroshock, consent was consistently required all the way through. Now, the extent to that consent and so on is a slightly different discussion, but still it did exist, and there are records of that, at least I've seen records of some of those consents at least, but I do know that they existed. So once patients arrived at the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital, they typically underwent 2 to 3 weeks of preoperative study on the research unit before a decision was made about whether they should have this procedure or not. And during this period of time, patients would undergo a host of different tests, including but not limited to a psychiatric evaluation, a physical exam, urine and blood tests, and an IQ test, work tests. And then all the results of these would be collated and presented in a document called a leucotomy summary, or a conference sometimes, by one of the physicians at the Toronto Psychiatric. And then that physician would present the patient's case at a leucotomy conference, like an actual conference in this case, even though the document sometimes was also called a conference. Very helpful. But after some discussion then that they would have, physicians who were present would essentially vote on whether a patient would receive psychosurgery or not after discussion, so that they all at least had a voice. And some patients were in fact deferred or rejected and sent back to Ontario Hospital, New Toronto, or others where they came from. And in fact, there were 9 patients that I'm aware of that were from New Toronto who were either rejected or their surgery was deferred. Those that were deemed to be good candidates were scheduled for surgery. The morning before a patient's operation was scheduled to take place, they were transferred from the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital down the road to the Toronto General Hospital by ambulance, which is apparently $8 round trip at the time. And they were accompanied by a nurse from the Toronto Psychiatric. The next morning, Mackenzie would perform a bilateral frontal leucotomy on that patient and other patients using an instrument and a technique that he designed and adapted based on similar procedures that were done elsewhere. After recovering sufficiently from the anesthesia, the patient was then transferred back to the TPH. And then they would spend about 5 to 6 weeks there after their operation under careful examination, though the amount of time they spent there afterwards decreased kind of as the years went by. Nevertheless, during this time, they would undergo all the same tests that they had done before the operation, and then their progress would be evaluated. At the end of the post-operative period, patients were then discharged from the TPH and transferred back to Ontario Hospital New Toronto, or whichever other Ontario hospital they might have come from. And it was there that patients began a more extensive rehabilitation program, because often, there would be, there's a number of factors, but they would often have, for example, be low on initiative, sometimes would be the way it's described. They might be, for a while, incontinent. They sometimes were described as kind of childlike and impulsive, and it took some time to kind of to help them rehabilitate. And so one of the things that's kind of problematic about the records, though, is that it isn't clear what the rehabilitation program was like at Ontario Hospital New Toronto. But based on what I know from my research in other provinces, the rehabilitation program likely involved helping patients reestablish some basic habits, such as personal grooming, which was important because tidiness was a key factor. If you're untidy, it's a problem for a patient. And then engaging them in various occupational therapy and recreational opportunities like knitting and playing games, and then visiting with family members or time with other patients to help to kind of re-socialize them and to get them more familiar, hoping that they can leave the hospital. So I want to end with a quote from a letter that C.B. Farrar, who was the director for a time at the Toronto Psychiatric Hospital, wrote to Kenneth Mackenzie in 1963 as he thought back on Jenny's case. Farrar wrote, "I remember the first case you operated, having such painful symptoms and the remarkable results. Have you the date? I wonder what became of that case eventually. I am honored in having had, however, how small a share of this great work of yours." So there's lots that can be said about the psychosurgery period, And there's lots of, I've kind of hinted at, there's certainly criticisms and so on, but, you only ever get a glimpse in popular portrayals, and it's usually, it's either the after effects as it was presumed to be. Certainly not everybody ended up being catatonic, though certainly not everyone, it didn't mean people were cured, certainly either. But it's the way it's presented is only a small portion. You don't actually see any process really often about how that happens. And so there's, often a misrepresentation in that regard.
Thank you, Brianne and Jennifer. We are now just at 8 o'clock, and we will be losing our closed captions or our live captioning at 8 o'clock, but we will continue on a little bit past, possibly to 8:15, maybe 8:20 if our speakers are down. I see nods, amazing. So I'd like to turn it over to the question period of the evening, asking in order that they've come in. Are you both ready for this? Fabulous.
We're ready.
So number one question is, was there any affiliation to Catholic healthcare in the history of the Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital?
So not directly, not in the way that there's an affiliation between some of the mental health care centers in Ontario today, who, like places like Waypoint in Penetanguishene, or I believe Providence in Kingston also has an affiliation to Catholic health. It really was much more a non-religious system in Ontario. In Quebec, it's a different story. But in Ontario, it was set up as a provincial system. It was mandated through the provincial government. And the only affiliation that you see in those early years of sort of the institutional period of the 19th century and into the early 20th century is religious services. And also some of the values that are expected in terms of heavily Protestant values, particularly in Southern Ontario. And so you see services at places like Ontario Hospital, New Toronto, being brought every Sunday by local ministers or sort of other individuals. And on the Catholic side, because it was a minority population in the area at the time, there was a Catholic priest who served New Toronto, but he did not offer services, at least not in the years that I've seen yet. But he did provide confessions and sort of consult with individual patients in that way.
Do you have anything you want to add to that, Brianne, or shall we move on to number two? Or
I don't know enough to answer that question, so I'm going to leave that with Jennifer.
So question number two is, how did people in the adjacent Lake Promenade cottages feel about living next to the hospital where shock therapies were taking place?
So I'm going to grab these just because these are local questions. With the area around the Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital, if you're not familiar with the area, it's absolutely beautiful. It's right on the edge of Lake Ontario. And the area directly beside it, to the west side, is a community called Long Branch. And it was actually developed in the late 19th century as a cottage area. So Torontonians would actually take a little boat all the way from the bottom of Yonge Street, all the way out to Long Branch at the, south of Etobicoke, in order to spend a weekend or a week or however much time they were spending with their families at a cottage, in much the same way that Torontonians now go north in Ontario to go to cottage country in different regions. So I suspect that there wasn't as much awareness. I mean, by the mid, into the 1930s and 40s, we're seeing a transition in the community so that it's less temporary cottagers and more permanent residents. You're seeing a transition in the community. And certainly by the time when Brianne's focused in the 50s and 60s, you are seeing very much an established community. So I think from what I've seen, like there's a growing, as you start to get towards, when the more established community, then the focus becomes more relevant. In those earlier years, when the institution is first established, it's almost, it's a non sequitur, because it's where your cottage is, it's a beautiful area. Of course, the asylum would be in a beautiful area as well. And there's a separation, versus when it becomes a residential area, there's more contact. You're this, the streetcars going by, the schools are nearby. We've spoken with people who remember, when the hospital farm would harvest its potato crop, that the smell of the rotting, leaves and that were left in the field would enter into the schools, or the potato bugs, the kids would race them and this kind of thing. But there then would be Unfortunately, like many other areas that had mental health institutions, there was then a growing sort of stigmatization. The fence went around along Lakeshore that separated the hospital from the community from a visual perspective, and it started some of those initial not the hauntings, that's a product after the institution closed, but more of the sort of classic stereotypes and stigma around the institution.
Thank you. If we can move on to the next question, because I think you both may be able to speak to this. How was the diagnosis of schizophrenia determined during the 1930s, and what was the ratio of women to men for this diagnosis? And then the second part of this question is, what was the use of insulin for this purpose? Was the use of insulin for this purpose endorsed by Banting and Best?
Do you want me to jump on that one as well?
Well, I'm just contemplating the last part. I'm like, I don't. Well, I don't. Do you know, Jen, off the top?
That I actually don't know. I mean, I think that there's certainly insulin shock therapy itself is developed in Europe. So I mean, that side of it has a separation. But I suspect that there must have been some sort of relationship in terms of the sort of just product delivery and availability within the city. I know that the University of Toronto and I think the Banting Institution or Institute was involved in that process, but in terms of whether or not they endorsed the procedure, that's a really good question we'll have to look into. Yeah.
I would say though that I do know that when the funding ended from the Rockefeller Foundation for the TPH, that the Banting Institute also, there was some funding provided. Now, to what extent and to what they would and would not, like if there was, would they allow, for example, insulin and not allow something else, or not at all, or it had to go to more the operations of the hospital in the absence of Rockefeller funding. We don't know, but, or at least I don't know at this point. But I do know there was at least some connection in that sense. But again, endorsement's a very far leap from just money, for instance. Yeah.
But in terms of the diagnosis, one of the things that's really interesting about the early 1930s is that when you do look through case records, there's this mass relabeling or re-diagnosing that happens across Ontario. So all of the institutions you'll see this for. And so there's a transition from patients being given a diagnosis of what's called dementia praecox, and then it's almost crossed out in their files in some places. Others actually insert a page into their case files that says now they've been diagnosed as schizophrenic. And there's a history there between sort of the transition between what was considered dementia praecox and what became schizophrenia. And it's not just a perfect language transition, the what's represented under the symptoms changes as well. Even what we think of as schizophrenia in the 1930s and 40s and 50s is going to be somewhat different from what we would recognize it as today. So those diagnoses change over time. But in terms of, sort of how somebody with a new diagnosis, rather than just someone being labeled in the, had already had sort of dementia praecox in the files, it's really around observational sort of categorization of the various symptoms that they are either exhibiting or that their family or their friends has described, and if they fit into the category of sort of what the descriptors of schizophrenia were. I don't know the ratio between men to women offhand. Maybe if Brianne might be able to speak to that, because I know that comes up in psychosurgery a bit.
Well, first of all, it was by far the most common that you would see in hospitals. But from what I've seen and what I understand, it's still fairly similar to what it is today with a one-to-one, which is what makes, in the case of psychosurgery, well, and actually all these treatments where they were used to primarily to try to see if it would help schizophrenia, and then when it didn't, then the next treatment that came along, it's maybe this one. But what's interesting in psychosurgery, at least, is that the numbers, like if you recall, there was 46 of 52 patients, for instance, who were female. And if there's a roughly, even if we're a little off, but roughly a one-to-one diagnosis, then there's an issue here with, like in that case, gender. You wonder what's happening with that. Yeah, I was going to say also too about schizophrenia, we have diagnostic criteria now. The first diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders didn't actually come out until 1952. And before that, just a little before that, you had the ICD classification, which was from, and is from Europe. And so before that, there was kind of, ideas of classification floating around, but nothing super standardized. But even still, and even after that, you had, I think there's 4 or 5 primary types of schizophrenia. So there's like a simple, catatonic, paranoid, and hebephrenic were the major types of schizophrenia. But even still, often I've looked at the records and, of course, I'm not a clinician, so not from that perspective. But when I look at the records, often I think, it seems to me that there was some differentiating behavior, but a lot of it, anytime they saw anything that would be classified as psychosis, it would be typically some form of schizophrenia. But I think that, and that's why in part it doesn't look similar to today, and our understanding today has evolved as happens. Yeah.
Thank you. If we could go to number 3, how is a cure from using shock therapy determined?
So there was a couple of different levels of what they considered to be a recovery. So there would be your full recovery or a full remission, where basically there was no signs of schizophrenia. That was it had to be absolutely no symptoms, no signs that schizophrenia still is present. And then there was sort of underlying levels of remission. So depending on whether or not there was a decrease in their symptoms, whether or not they had increased if they had any limited abilities, that that there was an increase in that way. And so they had sort of a grading system that changes, as far as I can tell, a little bit over time during the 1940s at New Toronto, although not significantly. And then they would sort of categorize people that way. People who faced a full remission would be sort of placed towards being discharged, but also people who had a partial remission. So it wasn't just that you had to make a full recovery. It also, if you had improvement in your symptoms, because I think also of that overcrowding problem they were facing, you could see people being discharged in that way as well.
Thank you. That was a good answer. Moving on to the next one, we do have quite a few more questions here. Were schizophrenia diagnoses so high because it was easier to classify anyone showing signs of psychoses that way, or do they remain this high?
Oh, they don't remain this high. And it's also, the numbers are, like when I said it was 50% of the population within Ontario's mental health institutions in the 1930s, that's within the institution. It doesn't represent the population as a whole. I think someone's going to hopefully correct me. I believe it's about 1% of the Canadian population who has a diagnosis of schizophrenia today, or sort of roughly in that range. I think what you end up seeing especially in the 30s, around the time when these shock therapies are beginning, and the reason why they're so focused on schizophrenia in particular, is that the earlier treatments, so things like moral treatment and hydrotherapy being sort of the 2 prominent ones that sort of predate this era, did not have an effect on schizophrenia. So other individuals who may have come in for things like depression, which may have been termed as melancholia at the time, or mania, or other sorts of situations, are being discharged at a different rate, and you're starting to see a population who's becoming your long-term population who all have that same diagnosis, and so you get a very different picture than what we might see today.
I was going to say too, it's not just it carries on, of course, right into psychosurgery, where the things that happen before it. But you see where people don't start saying insulin and all. Metrosol goes away for other reasons, but insulin especially and electroshock carry on for a little while, because even though they're recognizing it is not working for schizophrenia, they're saying, well, we know this works for affective disorders like depression, or people, well, yeah, there are other classifications. I was gonna say anxiety, but it's not just anxiety, we talk about just generally today, but other kinds of neuroses, I guess one could say. And so it stays for that kind of, that reason, but it's always like this hunt for something that's going to treat schizophrenia. And even after you have the introduction of antipsychotic medications that are one of the first, I would say, kind of more effective treatments, but they're not without their downfalls either. You end up, it's not an automatic, there's like insulin and psychosurgery and electroshock all still carry on a bit. So it's because not everybody's responding the same way to treatments, which is the way it is today too.
Thank you. On to the next one. Could being in an environment such as an overcrowded hospital with others showing symptoms of schizophrenia lead to others exhibiting these symptoms without being diagnosed?
I would say it would depend on the meaning of the question, but my gut reaction to the phrasing is no, because schizophrenia is not contagious. So that in that way is not possible. But could somebody's health be affected by living in an overcrowded institution? Absolutely. And so whether that's their physical health or their mental health, it is absolutely a problem within these institutions during overcrowding. And it was one of the reasons that this was always sort of a cause of concern within the reports that you're seeing throughout this era when the overcrowding is most prevalent. They're quite worried about this and the impacts that it's having, not even just on the patient level, but also even on the staff level too.
So turning to the shock therapies themselves, what was the most effective shock therapy between insulin, metrazole, and electrotherapy? Were there any recorded side effects?
Okay, so the most effective of the three was considered to be insulin shock therapy. The rates that I saw in the papers from the 1940s in New Toronto put it around 50% recovery. And it's one of the reasons I suspect that even though it was quite expensive, quite involved in terms of a process as compared to metrazole or electroshock, which were easier to administer. And so, that's why you saw it being sort of really relegated to New Toronto and it's serving the rest of the province, is because of those success rates. That was not something that metrazole or the early electroshock could, sort of compete with. Even today, ECT, sort of the contemporary version of that shock therapy, is no longer used with not typically used with individuals experiencing schizophrenia. They've changed the nature of who is actually receiving that therapy. It tends to be associated with those who have major depressive disorder or something similar, which is not the population that they were working with back in the 40s and the 50s. So it really was insulin, huge numbers. It was very expensive, timely, difficult. And the other part of that question was the side effects, I believe. So side effects were a range of different things. I mean, these were harsh physical treatments. So I saw a lot of concern in the reports around whether or not an individual had pre-existing heart conditions and the effects that could potentially have on them. They were all tested for tuberculosis ahead of time to see whether or not they had any damage to their lungs. But the biggest piece was was spinal injuries. The numbers that they reported were quite low, but these are still producing convulsions in the body. And so during that type of interaction, you did see injuries reported of people having injuries to their spine or even to their limbs, especially electroshock in the earliest years prior to them giving an anticonvulsant medication, so once they gave that medication, you weren't seeing the same kind of injuries. And I'm still, because I don't have the perfect start date for when it's introduced in Ontario, I'm not sure exactly where that falls, but that's something that I'm still looking into.
If I could just jump into, I wanted to say that I don't think you mentioned this, Jennifer, during the first part. I don't think so, but we often don't hear a ton about what, at least in the kinds of records that Jennifer and I looked at for this kind of thing and what's available often from a patient voice. The only kind of sometimes the patient voice I've seen in terms of metrazole was that there was a serious dislike of metrazole among patients. And it was one of the reasons that in many hospitals here and elsewhere, that it was abandoned sooner because patients dreaded it so much. And it was because the first 30 to 60 seconds before the convulsion kicked in, when you were given metrazole, it was described often by patients as experiencing a paralyzing fear of death. Was one of the ways in which I've seen it described in numerous ways. So it made people feel awful and terrified. And so I think that in that case, it's not, I don't know if you want to call that a side effect, but it's something to be said about patients saying, no, we really don't like this. And then insulin coming along, as well as electroshock, those were much more appealing for various reasons, including their success rates, but also because they didn't have to fight patients to go to them to the degree that they did with Metrazole.
Although electroshock, just to sort of touch on that, because it persisted past the 1950s when psychopharmaceuticals were introduced, replacing insulin shock therapy, you do see a raise in voices from patients, particularly into the 70s and 80s in the Toronto area. You start to get a lot of pushback against not necessarily whether or not there's any effect from electroshock, but really about what impact it is having on the individual in a bigger scale. And so you see a lot of writings from patients around that particular therapy, but it's coming in that later generation.
So to depart from this part of the talk and go back to the first part, the next question is, have any of the panelists experienced the alleged supernatural behavior themselves?
On the grounds? No. I spend a lot of time there. It is just a former hospital. It's a current college. It's very normal. We give tours of the tunnels. I mean, Nadine, you can speak to that as well.
Yeah, I used to live right across from the grounds, and I'm the biggest chicken you'll ever meet. And we work at strange hours, very early in the morning sometimes, or sometimes in the evening into dark. And it's just a college with students on it. So personally, I mean, everyone experiences the world differently. There's multiple different ways of, yes, I don't personally have any of those exciting or fantastical experiences. Brianne, do you have anything to add?
I have not been on site. I've been to Toronto to do research, and I've been to like a number of other places, but I have not specifically actually been. I think we probably said this at the beginning. When we said researcher in residence, I was researcher in residence virtually, given the situation.
She's our remote resident.
And we just had a comment come in from someone who says, as a former student ambassador who was always giving tours and lived on campus for 4 years, I never saw anything haunted, just a beautiful campus and area. So it's probably amped up because it tends to happen around October, but it goes cold in November, and then things change as we enter the holiday season. So I think it's probably one of those. It's a fun thing to read. But back to our questions over here. What was the downfall of leucotomy as a treatment option, and did the doctors finally just figure out that they couldn't guarantee a result?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that there are multiple downfalls. I mean, I didn't highlight them as much only just because I wanted to give a sense of the program and how the patients worked, that moved through that program for New Toronto. But the primary thing that ended up being a problem, well, there's a number of things, but ended up being a problem was that it, again, like we'd mentioned earlier, wasn't treating schizophrenia, which was consistently the main problem. I mean, I spent a number of years doing my research where I was like, why do they keep doing this on patients with psychosurgery or on patients with schizophrenia when they're noticing it? And there are lots of reasons as to why, because shock therapies by the 50s were much more commonly used, again, on affective disorders. But really the downfall in part, so there's the downfall from the physician perspective, but then you take the downfall from like a patient or, a critical perspective, and you've got this element of social control, just like Jennifer mentioned about the ways in which, if you look back on the use of electroshock and even any of the shock therapies really, but especially electroshock, you have to ask questions around, the punitive nature of these treatments. And so psychosurgery, if you, some of the typical language in files that you see are things like someone is resistive and violent and untidy and basically all the things that make someone, I think I mentioned earlier, a nursing problem. And really it's hard to read that in the records, to be honest, where it's, this is the most troublesome person here or, and such. And so it's people who are disruptive and pulling away nurses' attention and things. And so there's that downfall from a social control and patient perspective. And that's are some of the later criticisms that get raised as well, psychiatric survivors movements that kind of arise as well. But yeah, I mean, there were many downfalls. Also, people didn't recover to the degree that they wanted. I mean, all of these treatments, in fact, you know, there's such high hopes because of, you know, the potential that they offered, to, you know, a big problem in mental hospitals that weren't funded enough, that had too many people, you know, it was consistently not working. And so trying to grapple with that is also challenging from, you know, like if you're a professional as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. As our final question, just being mindful of time this evening, did the psychosurgery practices adopted in Ontario influence treatment practices elsewhere in Canada?
Well, if you're from Manitoba, well, at the time, not now, but if you're from Manitoba, you would have said that you were the first to do it in Canada. Numerous times in their records, the government seemed to think for a while that, you know, we were the first to do this. Indeed, that was clearly not true, because Manitoba doesn't start till 1943. So, but at the same time, you know, well, I should say what's interesting actually about Canada is that there seems to be much more interaction with people in the United States in different places with the physicians in different places in Canada. There's more interaction with the United States and provinces versus between or interprovincially, which I always found really quite interesting, because you'd think there would be more conversation, because they sometimes did meet across provinces. So there was some, but it really, you know, you end up seeing what we haven't talked about here, but you end up seeing like the transorbital lobotomy, which was, you know, more informally known as the ice pick lobotomy, because it was initially done with an ice pick. And that treatment, there was variations of that were used in Alberta, for instance. But then there's a treatment that was very similar to what Mackenzie did in Ontario that was used in BC, because it was his student, but even he went on a slightly different direction. And so really it's quite varied. And Manitoba did one that's much more common in the United States that wasn't really used elsewhere in Canada. So not really. In some ways I was puzzled by what seemed like isolation in their discussions about psychosurgery all the way along.
Do you have anything to add, Jennifer?
No, the question about the rest of Canada and psychosurgery is Brianne's doctoral research. So she is definitely the expert on that one.
Perfect. Well, that brings us to the end of our question period. I just want to say thank you for all the attendees who have joined us today and those who will join us once we post this recording on our YouTube channel. If you do want to know anything else about the hospital or ask a question, maybe as this is percolating this evening or over the next couple days, you can reach out to us via email at info@lakeshoregrounds.ca, or you can read more information on the hospital on our website, also at lakeshoregrounds.ca. I just want to say a quick thank you and shout out to our volunteers, Emily and Talia, who did an amazing job behind the scenes, and also thanking our captioner, who is no longer here, but we'll be sending them a thank you, as well as our student support and intervention coordinator for being here as well. So thank you for all your questions, and thank you panelists for joining us and sharing your expertise.
Thanks. Have a great night.
Have a good night.